archaeologists had said how these Egyptians would have a lot of labor and they would move these big things and put it on the barges. The Japanese tried to put them on the barges capsized. So they had to use steamboats. Jumping straight back into high technology, they used steamboats. So then they got it down the steamboats and they got down to the desert. Now you have to lift it and put it in the desert and erect it. When they took the stone off the steamboat, it sank in the mud. When they dragged it out of the mud, it sank in the sand. So they got cranes. The cranes broke. Then they got better cranes. And they lifted it up, and then comes the problem. Put it now in alignment like the great Egyptians. The Egyptians put those stones in such an alignment, they are 1/1000th of an inch accuracy. The only people on earth today who achieve that accuracy are opticians cutting glass. That is how they move that stone. That is how they cut that stone. The Japanese started to use helicopters. So they used air jackhammers instead of the so-called primitive tools or handmade tools of bronze tools. And then they used steamboats instead of the barges. And then they used cranes instead of all of these big masses of human labor they thought the Egyptians were using. And then they used helicopters. And then they decided they had to let it go. They couldn't do it. And they were not using 50-ton blocks which the Egyptians put at the top of their skyscrapers. They were using 2-ton blocks of stone, and they couldn't do it. So make no mistake, you are dealing with extraordinary people. Because the next myth coming up in the 21st century is how the Japanese are the superior people of the world. It's going to shift from the European to the Asiatic. So get it quite clear. In the very early stages of civilization, something very unusual happened. I was with my wife in Egypt last summer and we went to Aswan. And I looked at a block, an obelisk, a stone obelisk which had been cut many centuries ago. And I looked at the way it had been cut, the perfection of the cut. I looked at the stone. And I wondered why they had abandoned this obelisk. They abandoned it, they said, because it had a flaw. And I looked carefully. It is true, my eyes are not what they used to be. I could not see this flaw, so I used my hands, which are extremely sensitive. And it had to be pointed out to me where the flaw was, and it was very clear to me it would have taken centuries for that flaw to really make a difference. But our people didn't play around with things. It had to be perfect. When the Japanese were building the pyramid, when they tried to put the stones in alignment, they cracked and broke and were badly scratched. When they went to check the stones that the Egyptians had put into alignment, 1/1000th of an inch accurate, not a single stone was scratched or cracked. You are dealing with people who felt you had to be as perfect as possible. Let us pray that those of us, our people who learn of their heritage, their ancestors, will not accept mediocrity as their standards. People ask us, why are we so angry about this thing? Why are we so worked up about it? What does it matter? It happened thousands of years ago. Why does it matter? And the question arises, why does it matter to them? Because at UNESCO, when Diop went further, and he went between the derm and the epiderm, and he established through the melanin dosage test that the level of melanin, the density of melanin in the skin of the mummies was so great that it could not be leucoderm but melanoderm types, no caucasoids. And then Abdullah, the Egyptian delegate, note Abdullah, the Egyptian delegate, jumped up and said, even if they're black-skinned, they're white. They're just darkened by the sun. It's very hot out there, by the way. Do you know why it is important? Because the Egyptian, the modern Egyptian, is not an Egyptian. When the Egyptian Minister of Culture jumps up in the newspapers, I've seen it in some Dallas newspaper, the Egyptian Minister of Culture talking about my culture, my foot. It has nothing to do with him. The Arabs came into Egypt in 638 AD, thousands of years after the Pyramid Age. They have nothing to do with it. It's like President Reagan or President Bush talking about Teotihuacan. There is no connection. They cannot talk about Native American civilization because most of us in this room, with possibly only one or two exceptions, are not native to place. We are the Europeans and the Africans and the later Asiatic who came here, some of us dragged here, long after the Native Americans. So how can we call this, not this now, but how can we call Teotihuacan my culture? When Sadat was here, and Sadat was quite unusual, his mother was Sudanic, and he wanted to make a point, and he did it melodramatically. He said it on CBS, and they struck it off the air, although he repeated it later to Jesse Jackson. He said, I am a black man, and I'm the first true pharaoh in 2,000 years. And what he was trying to say is that I am different, I am native. I can lay claim to that civilization. Negri could have said that too. Very few of the Egyptians can say that. And this is not running down the Arab, as we shall see in the close of this lecture. The Arab, though he came in as a semi-primitive into Egypt, wild, roving, nomadic hordes, he was to draw upon the scientific heritage of Egypt too, and later on he was to make his own original and extraordinary contribution. We are not here to run down any people. We are just here to set the record straight. Because it seems that everybody has their heritage, but as soon as we try to claim ours, why are you making a fuss? We are making a fuss not because we are racists, I hope not. We are making a fuss because we have been scrupulously excluded from any major things in history. Wherever anything extraordinary is found in Africa, it cannot be African. Hamites brought it in. Asiatics brought it in. Caucasoids brought it in. We are the dumb, slow idiots of the world. And therefore, it is our duty to correct that impression. At the UNESCO conference in 1974, Jean Vercoute, an excellent Frenchman, admirable fellow for whom I have a great respect in spite of his schizophrenia on this matter, he said, okay, the language is clearly African, that has been established. The writing is African. The culture is African. And as Sav Soderbergh has shown in the head of the Scandinavian expedition to Sudanese Nubia, the techno-complex is African. The problem is, we really don't know for sure how many of them were African. Could you imagine doing that in Europe? The language is French. It is clear from studying the history of the French that this is a French development and accomplishment. They're using the Roman script which the Romans brought to the French, but we're not sure if they're Frenchmen. It's so absurd. But no, we could not be right when they tried cranial studies. Not everybody has a flat nose. Not everybody has pronounced prognathism. And I'm talking about pure unmixed Africans. There